coast is clear. Time for a bit of painting. The old blind down. Who's that? Now, where was I? Ah, yes, painting.
Hello, welcome back to the studio. Well, as you saw from my opening skit, there's a frustrated artist there, just trying to carve out a little bit of time to do some painting. And this happens a lot. It's such a busy world, we sometimes find ourselves under pressure to do so many other things first. I say, put your art first. Make time for yourself, and don't let other things get in the way. Having said that, let's get on with today's painting. It's another Bob Ross classic, Deep Wilderness Home, with a cabin of course. So you know the routine. Sit back, relax, notepad at the ready, and let's paint another Bob Ross classic.
So here's my canvas, 16 by 20 in portrait, that's upright. I want to start my painting by adding some black gesso to the lower half, actually just a bit less than half. This, I want to use a small foam brush. As you can see, I take a small amount first, just to sort of dry the brush slightly. Where the two areas meet, the background and the foreground, I want there to be a very sort of soft change of colour here. So I let the foam brush run out of paint almost completely. It stops me having a hard line midway through my painting. I use the edge of my foam brush to make the indication for a few tree trunks in the background. I set my special art watch for at least a half an hour drying time. So here's my canvas. Make sure this area at the bottom is completely dry before starting with oils. For this painting I'm going to be using this Bob Ross liquid clear oil paint. I use some in a small airtight container and use an old Bob Ross landscape brush to scrub it on. This must be applied sparingly. You only need a very thin, even coat. Barely any is all we're looking for. I'm using one of my paper DIY canvases. You can see in the round circle that there's barely any on the canvas, just enough to raise a slight sheen. It's important that you don't add too much, or your canvas will become too wet and slippery. I dry clean that old brush on some paper towel, and now I want to add my first colours. As you can see, I've put out some black and some sap green, and I'm just going to brush mix them, proportionately much more black. I want this to be quite a deep dark green colour. I'm going to add some firstly to the area which was covered with black gesso. The problem is, well, you can't see it. Only if you touch your fingers to it. Can you see that nice sort of olivey green colour? Not enough there, a bit oily. So we want much more this than the thin oily colour. I'll add some more. Scrub it in well, mix it in with the liquid clear. You can see where those two come together, there's a bit of a green hint just at that boundary. Once again, a quick fingertip test. That's it. Good strong colour. That's what we're looking for. Now let's look at the background. In the instructions, Bob says use some liquid white over the liquid clear, but I'm not so keen on that. It tends to make everything just a bit too wet and mushy. So I've got another old 1-inch brush, and I'm going to try using some titanium white paint. Just a little. I want to just coat the background with a very thin, even coat of titanium white mixed with liquid clear to sort of give me a very similar effect to liquid white. Again, just a very thin, even coat is all I'm looking for. Scrubbed well into the canvas. By the way, this is a wet on wet oil painting technique, so don't let any of these layers dry, apart from, of course, that black gesso. Now let's start adding some background foliage to my painting. I've switched back to that original 1-inch brush with the black and the sap green on it. And I'm going to use just the corner of the brush to twirl and swirl in some background detail, but nothing special. I just want to roughly block in where I think some trees are going to be. Here it is from another angle. As you can see, I'm just using the very tips of the brush just to swirl in some colour. Sometimes a little more green, sometimes a little more black. I've added some dark sienna, Van Dyke brown and alizarin crimson to my palette. Now, I gave my brush a little bit of a dry clean. I'm going to go straight into the dark sienna. This is the very lower edge of my painting. Maybe there are going to be some bushes or background foliage here that doesn't need to be, well, particularly green. As you see, it makes, well, a very odd looking colour. Now I've tipped into a little bit of the Van Dyke brown for a slightly deeper tone. I have to say, this isn't a very inspiring painting when you start out. In fact, well, it looks a bit of a dog's dinner. But trust me, it all comes together very nicely in the end. And finally, into some alizarin crimson. And once again, I'll pick just a few spots here and there to add some of this colour. Swirl it in, let it mix with the browns and the greens. But don't overdo it. If you stir these colours together too much, well, they lose even more definition. Right now, I just want a bit of a light patchwork quilt of colour with a slightly lighter area through the centre of my painting. To give my painting one final soft blend, I dry cleaned the brush I used for the titanium white. As I mentioned, there's a slightly lighter patch through the centre of my painting, but I'd only want to do a little bit of a soft blend on this. I wanted to have a nice sort of distant, misty, murky look, far back in the distance. And then finish off with a few light, flat brush strokes just to knock off any hard marks. I want to add the suggestion of a few tree trunks and branches to my painting. I'm using a Bob Ross liner brush and a few drops of linseed oil. That's my preference. I like using that better than I like using thinners. I'll be adding some highlights to my painting, so all I need is just the indication of a few trees. The odd branch, the odd trunk. If you enjoy my tutorials, don't forget, like and subscribe. If you subscribe, make sure you ring the little bell. That way when I launch a new video each week, you get a little notification in your inbox. If you want to do a little more to support the channel, you can always buy me a coffee. I spend the money on new paint supplies. Thank you. Now let's start off with some highlights. And for this, you're going to need a nice soft newish brush. Take special note, I load my brush on one side only. From habit, I usually have the little Bob Ross logo facing upwards. Notice how I pull my brush through various highlight colours. Cad yellow, Indian yellow and ochre, touch of sap green. Now pay special attention to the way I load the brush. See how I force it forwards into the paint, favouring one corner. Let's have a closer look. Here you see I've heavily loaded one corner of my brush, with a little bit more yellow on it. And that's the corner I'm going to be using for the highlighting. So watch carefully. I tip my brush at a slight angle. That favoured corner, the left-hand corner, is what's been touching on the canvas. And every time it touches, it leaves a tiny little drop of paint. Thousands and thousands of little speckles, each one a leaf. Don't press too hard when you're doing this. As the brush runs out of paint, I want to start working on maybe more shadowy areas of a branch. So I tap further and further back into the darkness of my painting. I reload and start on a new branch. Once again, as it runs out of colour, I start doing the sort of more darkened areas of the painting. You can do an awful lot of painting with one little touch of paint. Here you see I favoured more Indian yellow colour for this part of my painting. Vary your colours often. After a while, your brush will become clogged with paint, so take a moment to dry clean it. Knock off all that excess paint. Trust me, it'll stop you mixing so much mud. Now let's get into some Indian yellow and red. This produces a fiery orange colour. Whew. Wow, that's a real eye popper. Maybe just a little too red. I don't know. I like it. It's fun, but maybe I'll just put a touch of Indian yellow around it. Think about painting individual branches for a tree. Don't just do a lollipop shape, but just think about how each tree is made up of individual branches and limbs. You see, I'm favouring now the right hand corner of this brush. This means I'll be doing the trees on the left side of the painting. I know, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's the right-hand side of the brush for the left-hand trees and the left-hand side of the brush for the right-hand trees. It all sounds a bit confusing, but once you've been painting trees a little while, it all starts to make much more sense. Here you see I've started to paint more of the bushes at the base of these trees. But take a moment to notice where I positioned all those tree highlights. A nice random arrangement, you might think. Or is it? We'll see in just a moment.
So as you saw in that last little section of film, I just painted the background any old which way. Or did I? You see, sometimes you have to think ahead when you're painting. Positioning things in a very symmetrical pattern can really throw your eye out. I actually thought a little bit more about how I position these things relative to each other. The fact that there's sort of an odd number, and I positioned this particular one right in the centre above my cabin. I wanted you to look at the cabin, and this little tree, well, that's the usher saying, look here. Sometimes you have to think about your paintings as you're doing them, not just let it be sort of such a random thing. Anyway, with all that said, let's push on with the painting.
I'm getting all excited about painting this cabin, but first I need to put in some ground beneath it. I load my 1-inch brush completely flat this time, and I tap with the whole of the brush, not just a corner. I want to create the feeling of a piece of flat level land coming to the edge of a little cliff where I can have a waterfall. Now let's mark out the position of my cabin, right about where I painted that lovely branch. Oh well, never mind. I enjoyed it while it was there. I start off by marking the centre line for my little building and the lower edge at an angle. This is most important that we have this sort of upside down T shape. Maybe the corner of the wall here and another corner wall just here. I also want to work out where I want the peak to be. I want to aim for the top of that wall on the right. It's most important that this wall is the longest wall. It's the wall closest to you in the painting. And for the perspective to work, that needs to be slightly taller than the left wall. Also, I want this area to be going slightly uphill and off into the distance again. I also like to angle this wall downward slightly. Once again, it makes this wall look as though it's disappearing into the back of my painting. Those perspectives, they really can catch us out sometimes, but it just needs a little practice. I'll scrape this out and then you'll see the front and side of my little building complete. One of the most important lines on your building is this one, the ridge for the roof. Once again, notice how it slopes slightly down. If it goes up at the back, well, it looks like the building's actually getting bigger as it goes away from you, which really throws off the shape of this little cabin. I got so keen to paint the cabin, I forgot to paint the cliff. Let's start with a little bit of Van Dyke Brown on my palette knife. Now this is dark on dark, so I've done my best to try and change the lighting on the camera to pick up just the hint of brown colour. Notice I just drag the paint down the canvas over that black gesso. Remember, there's also some green and black under there as well, so this makes a nice deep tone. For a highlight, I'm going to take white, a little dark sienna, maybe a touch of Van Dyke Brown, and my favourite, yellow ochre. And I'm going to marble mix these together. Notice I just drag my knife through them 2 or 3 times, and that's it. Any more and it turns into a flat caramel tone. I'll take a small roll on the edge of my palette knife, and then with super light pressure, no pressure at all on that palette knife, just let the knife bump and drag down your painting. Top tip, don't try and highlight these cliffs twice. Do it once and then leave it alone. Because when you come back and try and interfere with it and change it and fiddle with it, well, they lose that lovely fresh look. They start turning into a sort of caramel colour. And I should know, I've mixed enough caramel in my time. And here you see a happy accident. I think I can see a little step in my rocks, maybe even a little stone floating at the edge of the water. I'm going to have a little waterfall on this right hand side. I need just a couple of stones just to hold it in. Once again, you see my colours getting a little bit sort of caramel brown colour, but they're only small. I'll live with it. Now, for my waterfall, I've got some phthalo blue, some white, and a touch of black. I don't want this to be overly bright. I don't want this to be taking your eye off the main feature, which is the cabin. So you see the colour looks, well, quite grey. I'm using a fan brush with firm pressure across and then straight down. Just let the brush fall under its own pressure. Use gravity to help you. As I said, I keep this fairly muted. I don't want it too bright. But I do want it to be splashing at the base, so I use the corner of the fan brush and do a little few upward strokes. And at the very bottom of the painting, I want this to be water. I'll use my brush on the edge and just do a few nice zigzags. Leave a little dark here and there and paint around that little stone. It worked out quite nicely in the end. Time to bring some foliage over the edge of the rocks. Notice I use my nice 1-inch brush again and load one corner, and here you see I'm sort of tipping the brush over at 90 degrees so it looks like it comes over the edge and down the side of the cliff. I aim for some of the nice little dark spots here and there where there's no highlighting. This colour will stick far more easily in these areas, but can't help thinking that little bit there looks a bit on the bright side, so maybe I'll just come back and touch that up a little bit. There's a couple of straight edges too, I'll give a little bit of attention to. A little touch of Van Dyke Brown, and I'll just break that edge up a little bit and run a little bit of that dark colour over this area too. Small touch-ups are fine, but notice I lived with it for at least a few hours before I did that. Take your time when you're painting, don't rush into fixing things that maybe don't need fixing. Here you see my happy little accident, a little bump in the rock, gives me an excuse to have some of my little foliage tumbling down the side and over that little edge. A few more touches, let them get a bit darker down towards the water's edge. I think that really brings it all together rather nicely. I think I'll add a little bush above the waterfall, but save that little dark area. Maybe that's where the critters live. I want to add a little more light to my watery area, so I've loaded the palette knife with a little bit of a bright colour here, just for a waterline, a little bit of sparkle, maybe a little bit more of a splash and crash across the surface of the water. I take a little bit of extra light blue colour on my palette knife, just to add a little more detail directly at the base of the falls. Now let's get back to the cabin. I'm going to load my palette knife with a small roll of Van Dyke Brown, just a little, and I'm going to use this to stain the front of my cabin. Firm pressure, really press this down into the canvas. I just want a stain of colour, not thick heavy dark paint, just the stain. I also want to add an extra additional area of overhang to the side of the building. It makes such a difference if you can get that roof to just sort of jut out a little further. I'll also add a little of this Van Dyke Brown to the sidewall, being sure not to lose that line. For the roof, I'll use some black with a touch of that sap green colour. I'm just going to block this in again, just a small roll along the ridge, press and pull down firmly. I also add a little of this dark black mixture to this area of my painting It's the overhang of the roof where it meets the sidewall, and also a little of the overhang in this area. These little shadow lines make our building look really three-dimensional. Now, back to the highlighting. The same colour I used for my rocks. I take a little of that, a tiny roll, and just add the indication of a few little boards here and there. You can play with this as much as you like. If you don't like it, just take your palette knife, scrape it off and start again. It takes a little while, so I'll do a little bit of time lapse through this area. Just be careful not to lose some of those edges, especially that one. It can get a bit ragged looking. After a lot of fiddling, I end up with this. And I think it looks suitably woody, nice and old. For the roof, I want some old shingles. I chose to use some blue-grey colour for this. White, Prussian blue, the same colours I used for the water. Now, I just touched them on here with the palette knife. I tried this direction, and I also turned the palette knife and tried it another direction, this way. And I'm not sure which I like best, or if I like any of it, but, well, it's an old building, and I'm not going to get too fussy with it. I'll put a little bit extra on the ridge, just a few touches here. Maybe I'll add a little bit of moss to it. I think it works well. Another small area of detail is on this side of the building. Just use the edge of the palette knife to indicate the ends of some of those little shingles. See, it's the small things that make the biggest difference. Look how that really makes that roof pop. There, I'm really rather pleased with it now. Here's my little bit of moss on the tip of my palette knife. And I think I've got a really nice old building. Now, do I push my luck and add the porch? Yes, of course I do. I just use my palette knife and just cut through the paint. Remember, slightly bigger at the front and smaller at the back. A few more shingles, and maybe a couple of posts to hold it up. I stand back and add another little detail. I want a shadow. So I use some of that dark green colour from the palette, and to make it really stand out, I think I'll edge it with a little bit of highlight. Once again, pay attention to these little details. They can make such a big difference to the finished painting. I think I need to add a few windows and maybe a door to my painting as well. I use the small edge of my palette knife to scrape away the paint. 1, 2, 3 and 4. I'll go back into some of that very, very pale blue colour and just edge the windows with a little bit of highlighting colour. This doesn't need to be very accurately done, just a suggestion is all that's needed. Again, it's another one of those little details that you don't have to work too hard at, but makes such a big impact on the finished painting. I'll also add a little door under the porch, and that'll get its own little frame as well. Adding all these little extra details is what really elevates the quality of your paintings. Always give yourself time to sit and look at your paintings, then make these little adjustments. These small additions are so important to your painting. I can't emphasize that enough. And here's another little neat touch. A dot of green paint on the end of my palette knife. I want to grow a little bit of ivy. Just a few dots here and there. Just imagine it spreading up the side between those old boards. Softens up that hard edge. With that, I think my painting is almost complete. Deep Wilderness Home, a Bob Ross classic, with a little extra from yours truly.
So there we have it. Another lovely Bob Ross classic, Deep Wilderness Home. But don't move. If you've got time on your hands, there's another lovely video coming right along. Time on your hands.